Have you ever looked up at the night sky and wondered if your destiny is really written up there among the stars? For literally thousands of years, we've looked to the heavens for answers, and that's given us two, well, very different ways of seeing the cosmos: astrology and astronomy. So let's dig in. So many of us check our horoscopes, right? For some, it's just a bit of fun with your morning coffee. For others, it's a genuine source of guidance, a real belief. But that brings us to the big question. Is it all just harmless fun, or is there maybe more to the story of how they're supposed to work, or not work? Okay, so let's get our terms straight, right? On one side, you've got astrology. That's the ancient system of divination that says, hey, where the planets were when you were born can shape your personality and your future. And on the other side, you've got astronomy, which is the actual scientific study of what those stars and planets are, what they're made of, and how they move. Now here's where it gets really interesting. These two things, astrology and astronomy, they weren't always on opposite teams. They actually share a common ancestor. To really understand how they split apart, we gotta look at the evidence, kind of like detectives on a case. For centuries, watching the sky was a two-for-one deal. You could predict the seasons for farming and try to predict your fate. But the paths started to fork, really beginning with the work of the astronomer Claudius Ptolemy way back in the 2nd century. Then the final official breakup, that happened in the 18th century, when astrology was kicked out of universities as a serious academic subject. All right, so let's crack open our first case file, Exhibit A. We're going to look at the absolute foundation of modern astrology, the zodiac, and, well, we're going to find some pretty fatal flaws from an astronomical point of view. The biggest problem comes down to something called the precession of the equinoxes. It's basically a super slow wobble in the Earth's axis, kind of like a spinning top that's starting to slow down. Because of that wobble, the star map that horoscopes use is off by about 2,000 years. So that sign you think you were born under, yeah, well, astronomically speaking, the sun probably wasn't even in that constellation on your birthday.
And there's another major issue. Astrology slices the year up into 12 neat, tidy signs, each getting about 30 days. But in the real sky, the sun's path, what we call the ecliptic, it just doesn't work that way. I mean, look at this chart. The sun spends a whopping 45 days in Virgo, but only a tiny 7 days zipping through Scorpio. That neat 12-slice pizza of the zodiac, it just doesn't match reality.
And speaking of that path, what if I told you that the whole system of 12 signs is missing something? Astronomically, there aren't 12 constellations on the sun's path, there are 13. Yep, the ancient Babylonians knew about it, but they apparently ignored a whole constellation just to make their calendar nice and tidy. It's called Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer. An entire sign was just left out.
Okay, let's move on to Exhibit B. Because even if we pretend the star maps were correct, there's another huge question. If the planets and stars are influencing us, there has to be some kind of physical force, right? A mechanism that makes it happen. So what could that be?
Well, the only physical force we know of that planets exert on us from a distance is gravity. But get this. The gravitational pull from a person standing just a meter away from you is actually greater than the pull from the planet Mars. Think about it. The doctor who delivers a baby has way more gravitational influence on it than any planet in our solar system. There's just no known physical way for astrological effects to be sent across all that space.
So if the star map is wrong, and there's no physical motive, why does astrology feel so right so often? For that, we turn to our final file, Exhibit C, the psychological alibi. Because the answer, it turns out, isn't out there in the stars. It's right inside our own heads.
This is all about something called the Forer effect. It's a real, well-documented psychological bias where we humans have a tendency to accept really vague and general statements as if they were written just for us. You know, things like, you have a great need for other people to like and admire you. Of course you do, most people do. Horoscopes are absolute masters of this trick.
And here's how it reels you in. It's a process called subjective validation. See, your brain is an amazing pattern-matching machine. When you read a general statement in a horoscope, your mind immediately starts hunting for evidence, for a personal connection. You remember that one time it felt totally true, we call that a hit, and you just unconsciously forget all the dozens of times it didn't apply at all, the misses. We literally build the case for astrology inside our own minds.
Now, this whole investigation into astrology actually points to a much, much bigger question. What separates real, hard science from something that just kind of looks like science? So let's talk about the rules of the game.
One of the absolute key differences was laid out by the philosopher Karl Popper. He called it falsifiability. Here's the deal. For a claim to be truly scientific, there has to be some kind of test or observation that could, in theory, prove it false. Pseudoscience, on the other hand, makes claims that are so vague or have so many excuses that you can never, ever prove them wrong.
The great astronomer Carl Sagan had the perfect analogy for this. He said, "Imagine I tell you, I have a dragon in my garage. You're excited. You say, 'Let's see it.' But I say, 'Oh, sorry, it's an invisible dragon.' So you suggest, 'Okay, let's spread flour on the floor to see its footprints.' Good idea, I say, but this dragon floats."
You keep trying. What about a thermal camera to see its heatless fire? No, the fire is heatless. For every single test you can think of, there's a special reason why it won't work. And this leads to Sagan's powerful, simple question. What is the difference between such a dragon and no dragon at all? If a claim can't be tested, it doesn't the same thing as being true.
So after looking at all the evidence, from astronomy, from physics, and from inside our own minds, what's the final verdict in the case of astrology versus science?
The verdict is in. And based on all the evidence and playing by the rules of science, astrology just doesn't hold up. First, its foundational map, the zodiac, is astronomically wrong. Second, there's no known physical force that can make it work. Third, that feeling of it being so true is perfectly explained by psychological effects. And finally, its claims aren't falsifiable, which is a deal breaker for science. So while it can be a fun and meaningful tradition for people, it isn't to science.
But look, this was never just about astrology. Learning how to spot the difference between a claim that can be tested and one that can't, that's like a superpower for navigating our modern world, which is full of information. So the real question I want to leave you with is this. Now that you know how to spot a pseudoscience, what else do you see differently?